August 1944. A Royal Air Force pilot named Desmond Scott is flying low over a stretch of French countryside near the town of Falaise, and what he sees below him he will never be able to forget for the rest of his life. The roads are choked, not with traffic, with wreckage, and with the swollen bodies of men and horses. A whole German army has been trapped here and destroyed from the air and the ground, and its remains are strewn across the fields and the sunken lanes in a way that the mind struggles to take in. Years later, when Scott sits down to describe it, he will say that of everything he saw that day, it was the shape of the horses that upset him the most. They had been harnessed to their wagons, so they could not run, and so they died where they stood, in tangled heaps, their wide eyes, he wrote, seeming to cry out to him in anguish. Hold that image, because it is the true beginning of this story. Those dead horses in their harnesses were not a strange exception. They were the German army. They were how it moved, how it hauled its guns, how it carried its bread and its bullets to the front, and how, in the end, it failed to get away when the trap closed. And at that very moment, on other roads in that same corner of France, in that same August, something was moving in the opposite direction that could not have been more different. A river of American trucks, thousands of them, bumper to bumper, day and night, hauling fuel and shells and food eastward toward the German border faster than any army in history had ever been supplied. The name for that river was the Red Ball Express. This is the story of those trucks and the men who drove them. It is the story of how the United States Army solved a problem that the German army never solved, never could solve, and in some deep sense had decided long before the war that it did not need to solve. It is the story of 23,000 American drivers, most of them black soldiers in a segregated army that did not want them in combat and would not fully honor them for decades, who kept the entire Allied advance alive for 83 days in the autumn of 1944. And it is the story of the 2.75 million horses that the German war machine used across the whole of the Second World War, and of why, in the end, all those millions of animals could not do what a few thousand young men in overloaded trucks did every single day and every single night. To understand the gulf between those two roads, the one paved with dead horses and the one flowing with trucks, we have to begin with a myth, not a small myth. One of the largest and most durable myths of the 20th century. The myth is this, that the German army of the Second World War was a mechanized juggernaut, a force of tanks and half-tracks and roaring engines, the most motorized army in the world, the army that taught everyone else what modern war looked like. Almost everyone believes some version of this. It is in the films, it is in the video games, it is in the grainy newsreel footage that has been replayed for 80 years. And it is, to a degree that genuinely shocks people the first time they learn it, not true. Here is the truth that the historian Richard Dinardo laid out in his study of the subject, and that the numbers confirm from every direction. About 75% of the German army relied on horses for transport. Not at the beginning of the war only. Not on the Eastern Front only. Throughout. From the invasion of Poland in 1939 to the invasion of the Soviet Union to the fighting in France in 1944, the horse was the engine of the German army. Germany entered the war with 514,000 horses in military service. Over the course of the war it employed, in total, 2.75 million horses and mules. At any given moment, on average, there were 1.1 million horses in German uniform, so to speak, hauling guns and wagons and supplies. Look at the divisions, and the picture gets even sharper. Of the 322 German and Waffen-SS divisions that existed in November of 1943, only 52 were armored or motorized. A year later, in November of 1944, of 264 divisions, only 42 were armored or motorized. Everything else, the great mass of the German army, the ordinary infantry divisions that did most of the fighting and most of the dying, marched into battle on foot. Their artillery was pulled by horses. Their supplies came forward in horse-drawn wagons. A single German infantry division in this period needed somewhere between 4,000 and 6,000 horses just to function. The famous panzer divisions, the ones in all the photographs, were a hard, sharp minority riding at the front of an army that was, underneath, a 19th century army wearing a 20th century reputation. So why does the myth exist? Why does almost everyone picture the German army as a wall of engines? The answer is one of the more remarkable pieces of propaganda in modern history, and it worked so well that it fooled the world for generations. Joseph Goebbels, the German propaganda minister, understood the power of the image better than almost anyone alive. He gave specific instructions that the newsreels shown in cinemas were to film mechanized traffic, tanks, trucks, motorcycles, the roaring modern machinery of war, the horses, the millions of horses, the wagons and the plodding columns, and the animals dying in the mud. Those were not to be filmed. That footage, the tank footage, the engine footage, was repeated endlessly during the war, and then it became the raw material for the documentaries and the films that came afterward, which became the raw material for the video games that came after those. And so a small mechanized minority was filmed until it looked like the whole, and the horse-drawn reality of the German army was quietly left on the cutting room floor. But an army cannot hide its own nature from itself. The German High Command knew exactly what it was riding on. Colonel General Franz Halder, one of the senior planners of the invasion of the Soviet Union, calculated that each infantry division would need around 4,500 horses and roughly 2,000 horse-drawn vehicles. That was the plan. That was not an accident or an emergency measure. That was the design of the army from the ground up, and the reason it was designed that way brings us to the thing underneath everything, the thing that would eventually leave those horses dead in their harnesses at Falaise. Germany did not have the oil. It did not have the industrial capacity. It could not build enough trucks, and it could not have fueled them if it had built them. A horse, whatever else you say about it, runs on grass and oats and hay, and Germany could grow those. A truck runs on gasoline, and Germany was chronically, desperately, fatally short of gasoline for the entire war. The horse was not a choice made out of tradition or stubbornness alone. It was a choice made out of poverty. The German army rode horses because it could not afford to do anything else, and this dependence was not a German peculiarity alone. It is worth pausing to understand how the whole world moved in that era, because it makes the American achievement stand out even more sharply. The Soviet Union, Germany's great enemy in the East, leaned just as heavily on the horse. Over the course of the war, the Red Army employed something on the order of 3.5 million horses, even more than Germany. Between them, the two largest armies on the continent of Europe used more than 6 million horses to fight the Second World War. The horse was not the exception in that war. The horse was the rule. Britain had mechanized its cavalry in the years before the war, and the United States had very nearly finished doing the same. But on the vast battlefields of the East, and in the ordinary infantry divisions of Germany, the animal that had carried armies since the days of the pharaohs was still carrying them, right into the age of the tank and the radio and the aircraft. Which is exactly why what the Americans did was so strange, and so hard for their enemies to comprehend. They were not simply better at the old game, they were playing a different game entirely. Now hold that image in your mind, because we are about to cross to the other side, and the contrast is the whole point of this story. On the American side, there was no shortage of oil, no shortage of steel, and above all, no shortage of trucks. The United States built, during the war, more than 2 million military trucks, more than 800,000 of the 2.5-ton trucks alone. It was the truck, as much as the tank, that made the American army the most mobile fighting force the world had ever seen. And America had so many trucks that it did something no other nation could dream of doing. It gave them away. It shipped hundreds of thousands of trucks to its allies. More than 395,000 went to the Soviet Union, where the Red Army came to depend on the American truck to carry its infantry and tow its guns, and, in time, to haul the rocket launchers that terrified the German soldier. There is a small, telling story inside that larger one. A great many of the trucks sent to the Soviet Union were built by the Studebaker Company, and the Russian soldiers came to love them so much that they gave them an affectionate nickname of their own, the Studer. These trucks were shipped across the world, driven up through the deserts and mountain passes of what was called the Persian Corridor, into the heart of a country fighting for its life. The Soviet troops found that the American engine would run on almost any fuel they could scrounge, and they piled loads on it far beyond anything its designers had imagined. They bolted rails to its bed and turned it into a mobile launcher for the screaming rocket salvos the Germans learned to dread. The leader of the Soviet Union himself, Joseph Stalin, sent a personal letter of thanks to the American company for the quality of those trucks. Think about what that means. One of the most powerful men on earth took the time to thank a truck manufacturer because the truck had become that important to the war. Think about that contrast for one moment. Germany scoured occupied Europe for horses and still never had enough. The Soviet Union used millions of horses and still begged for American trucks and received them by the hundreds of thousands. And America built so many trucks that it handed them to other countries by the hundreds of thousands and still had more than it needed. This was not a small edge. This was a difference of kind, not degree. One side ran on engines it could not stop producing. The other side ran on animals it could not stop burying. But building the trucks was only half the problem. Having them and using them are two very different things. And in the summer of 1944, the American army was about to run headlong into the second half of the problem, in the most dramatic way imaginable. Because it is one thing to have the most mobile army on Earth. It is another thing entirely to keep that army fed and fueled when it starts to move faster than anyone planned for. To understand what happened next, we have to go back to the beaches. On June 6, 1944, the Allies landed in Normandy, and then for almost 2 months they were nearly stuck. The Germans fought for every hedgerow, every field, every sunken lane, and the front barely moved. The Allied planners, looking at this slow, grinding fight, made their supply plans accordingly. They assumed a careful, methodical advance. They assumed they would build up their forces gradually and push forward at a measured pace, and that the supply system would keep step with them the whole way. They planned to support around 12 divisions as they advanced, and they did not expect to be pushing far beyond the Seine River until well into the autumn. They had even planned to lean on captured ports and on fuel pipelines running up from the Normandy coast. It was a reasonable plan for the war they expected to fight. It was the wrong plan for the war they got. Because at the end of July, the whole thing broke open. Operation Cobra shattered the German line, and suddenly the Americans were not grinding forward. They were racing. General George Patton's Third Army in particular tore across France with an aggression that astonished the very Germans who had invented this kind of warfare. Units that were supposed to advance at a measured pace were covering as much as 80 miles in a week. The plan had assumed 12 divisions west of the Seine. The reality, by the end of August, was that the supply system was trying to feed 28 divisions, and many of them were more than 150 miles east of where anyone had expected them to be. The pursuit was a triumph. It was also, from the point of view of the men whose job was to keep it supplied, very nearly a disaster. This is the moment where a modern army either wins or strangles on its own success. Because an army in full advance is a ravenous thing. Each of those divisions in combat consumed somewhere around 750 tons of supplies every single day. Fuel, ammunition, food, oil, spare parts. Medical supplies. Multiply that across 28 divisions, and you get a daily appetite of tens of thousands of tons that had to come forward, every day, without fail, or the advance would simply stop where it stood. And of all the categories of supply, one loomed above the rest: gasoline. The First Army and the Third Army together were burning through as much as 800,000 gallons of gasoline in a single day, feeding the Sherman tanks and the tank destroyers and the half-tracks and the trucks and the guns that made up a modern mechanized force. An army like that does not run on courage. It runs on fuel, and it runs out of fuel with terrifying speed. And here was the nightmare. The supplies were still back at the beaches. Almost everything the Allied armies needed was still coming ashore in Normandy, hundreds of miles behind the fighting. The great French ports that were supposed to solve this problem were useless. Some, like Cherbourg, had been so thoroughly demolished by the Germans before they surrendered it that it took months to bring it up to full capacity. Others were still held by German garrisons under orders to hold out as fortresses, and some of those garrisons would hold until 1945. Antwerp, the great deep-water port that would eventually solve the whole crisis, would not be captured until November, and even then the Germans had so wrecked its approaches that it could not begin unloading ships until nearly the end of that month. And the French railway network, the obvious way to move enormous tonnage over long distances, was in ruins. The cruel irony was that the Allies themselves had wrecked it. In the months before the invasion, Allied bombers and the French resistance had systematically destroyed the French rail system, the bridges and the marshalling yards and the locomotives, precisely so the Germans could not use it to rush reinforcements to Normandy. It had worked, and now that same wrecked railway could not carry Allied supplies forward either. So the situation in late August of 1944 came down to something brutally simple. The fastest advance in the history of the United States Army was about to run out of gas, literally, because there was no way to get fuel and ammunition from the beaches of Normandy to the front lines fast enough. Everything the Allies had fought for since June was about to grind to a halt, not because of German resistance, but because of distance. The tanks would sit, the guns would fall silent. The Germans would be handed the time they desperately needed to regroup behind their own border. Unless someone could find a way to move tens of thousands of tons of supplies across France with the one tool that was still available, the truck. The plan was born in a single frantic meeting. Depending on which account you read, the planners worked for something like 36 to 38 hours straight to build it. The men most associated with organizing it were officers of the Transportation Corps and the Services of Supply, among them a colonel named Laurent Ayres, a man so single-mindedly focused on moving tonnage that he earned the nickname Little Patton. The idea they arrived at was elegant in its simplicity. They would take every truck they could find and run them in a continuous loop, a one-way circuit, from the supply dumps near the beaches all the way forward to the depots behind the front and back again. One set of roads would carry the loaded trucks forward. Another, parallel road, would carry the empty trucks back. Civilian traffic would be banned from the route entirely. Military police would control every junction around the clock, so the trucks never had to stop. And to move the whole thing with the urgency it demanded, they gave it a name, borrowed from the American railroads. For decades, railroad men had used a term for priority freight, for the express shipment that got a cleared track and moved ahead of everything else. Around the year 1892, the Santa Fe Railroad had begun marking such priority trains and their cleared tracks with a red ball. The term had spread across American railroading until it simply meant fast, urgent, priority cargo that stops for nothing. So when those exhausted planners needed a name for a truck route that would carry the most urgent cargo in the entire war and stop for nothing, the name was obvious. They called it the Red Ball Express. And on Friday, August 25, 1944, the same day that Paris was liberated, the first trucks rolled. They rolled out of Saint-Lô, a town in northwestern France that had been so completely smashed by bombing and shelling that the drivers could barely thread their trucks through its ruined streets, one vehicle at a time. That first day, 67 truck companies put roughly 3,500 trucks on the road and carried around 4,500 tons of supplies eastward, toward the depots being set up in the triangle of land between the towns of Chartres, La Loupe, and Dreux, just outside Paris. The route ran east on one highway and looped back west on another, and in its earliest form, the full circuit ran something like 300 miles. The drivers refueled and caught what rest they could at a support center near the town of Alençon, roughly the midpoint, where mechanics stood by to patch up whatever had broken on the way. Then they pushed on, past ancient villages and apple orchards, until the great twin spires of the medieval cathedral at Chartres rose out of the plain ahead of them. They unloaded, and they turned around, and they did it again. To keep that river flowing, the army did something that sounds simple, and was in fact an enormous feat of organization. It set aside whole highways for the exclusive use of the Red Ball. The signs went up, large rectangular boards painted with a red ball, marking the route so that even where there were no soldiers to direct traffic, the drivers knew which road was theirs. And where the junctions were, the military police stood. The 793rd Military Police Battalion was attached to the operation from August all the way through December, and its job was to keep the route clear and keep the trucks moving. The military police directed traffic through the narrow streets of the villages, around bomb craters, across damaged bridges, waving the trucks through so that nothing ever had to come to a halt. There is a story, told by a staff sergeant named Chester Jones, about one hapless soldier in a jeep who accidentally turned onto the Red Ball route and found himself trapped, sandwiched between two of the big trucks, unable to pull off the road, carried helplessly along for 100 miles before he could finally escape. That is how relentless the flow was. Once you were in the river took you where it was going. Now here is where the story becomes about people, because a plan on paper moves nothing. Trucks do not drive themselves, and the men who drove the Red Ball Express were, in overwhelming proportion, black American soldiers serving in an army that had decided they were not fit to fight. This is the part of the story that was left out for a very long time, and it deserves to be told plainly. The United States Army in the Second World War was segregated by law and by custom. Black soldiers were, with relatively few exceptions, kept out of combat units and funneled into service and supply roles. They loaded ships, they built roads, they worked as mechanics, they drove trucks. The reasoning behind this was a set of racist assumptions, widespread among the white officer corps of the time, that black soldiers lacked the aptitude and the courage for frontline fighting. It was wrong, and it was believed anyway, and it shaped where hundreds of thousands of men were allowed to serve. By the summer of 1944, nearly 700,000 black soldiers were in the United States Army, and the great majority of them were in exactly these kinds of support units. When the Red Ball Express was thrown together in that desperate week, it was staffed, by most accounts, at around 3/4 black soldiers. The motor transport service in the European theatre was roughly 73% African American. These were the men who would now carry the entire Allied advance on their backs. Consider what the job actually was. A driver on the Red Ball worked in a two-man team so that one could sleep while the other drove, though in practice, sleep was a rumor more than a reality. The round trip on the route could run more than 50 hours, sometimes 54 hours or more, and the drivers pushed themselves through shifts of 20 hours and beyond. At any given moment during the operation, an average of around 900 vehicles were somewhere out on the road. The trucks moved day and night, 7 days a week, and at night they moved under blackout conditions, their headlights masked down to thin slits of light that the soldiers called cat eyes, so that German aircraft and snipers could not spot the convoys. Picture that for a moment. A 19-year-old at the wheel of an overloaded truck, on a shattered French road at 2 in the morning, in the rain, with no real headlights, feeling his way forward by instinct and the faint glow of the truck ahead, hour after hour after hour, hauling the fuel and the shells that would let the tanks keep fighting the next day. And as he drove, he passed the wreckage of the war on either side of the road, the burned-out vehicles, the bombed villages, the dead livestock, and sometimes hungry civilians standing at the roadside hoping the trucks might stop. The trucks did not stop. We know their names, some of them, because a few of these men lived to tell what it was like. A driver named James Rookard, 19 years old, from Maple Heights, Ohio, remembered the roads. He said there were dead bodies and dead horses on the highways after the bombs had fallen, and that he was scared, but he did his job and hoped for the best. He also described what the driving itself was like in the dark. He said he had driven when he could hardly see, going by instinct alone, feeling the road beneath the wheels, feeling the road. That is how the supplies got forward. Another driver, a man named Washington Rector who served with a quartermaster truck company, remembered something harder to put into words. He remembered that you simply accepted the discrimination, that the men were even warned not to associate with white soldiers for fear of the trouble it might cause. These men were risking their lives to keep the American army moving, and they were doing it inside a system that treated them as second class in the very moment they were becoming indispensable. One driver summed up the sheer variety of what they hauled in a single plain sentence. "We carried anything," he said, "from straight pins to tank parts, and we carried them in all kinds of conditions and all kinds of weather. And it was not only cargo. When the fighting demanded it, the trucks of the Red Ball carried men. On occasion, the drivers were pressed into service to rush whole units of infantry forward toward the front, along with army nurses and replacements, headed for the fighting. The trucks that carried shells to the guns one day might carry soldiers to the battle the next. Nor did the trucks run empty on the way back, whenever it could be helped. On the return leg, they hauled the spent brass of fired artillery shells, the empty fuel cans to be filled again at the beaches, sometimes German prisoners bound for the rear, and, in the quietest and most somber cargo of all, sometimes the bodies of American soldiers being brought back from the front. The river ran in both directions, and it was never idle if the men who ran it could prevent it. The danger was constant, and it took many forms. The most famous enemy of the Red Ball, strangely enough, was not the German Air Force, which by the autumn of 1944 had been so thoroughly beaten down that it rarely troubled the convoys, tempting as they were. The real enemies were the road and the exhaustion and the machines themselves. Trucks broke down constantly, and one of the stranger causes was water getting into the fuel. Sometimes it was simple condensation, but sometimes it was sabotage of a quiet kind. German prisoners of war were often used to help load the trucks and fill their tanks in the rear areas, and some of them learned that if they left the caps off the fuel cans, the rain and the snow would foul the gasoline and stop the trucks cold, at least for a while. It was a small act of resistance from men who had lost the war but had not stopped fighting it, and it added one more headache to a job that already had too many. To keep the river flowing against all of this, the army built a whole system of care and repair around the route. Engineers patrolled the roads, filling craters and shoring up damaged bridges, trying to fix the damage as fast as the pounding traffic created it, and to do it without ever slowing the flow. Roving mechanics worked on broken trucks right there at the roadside, and when a truck could not be saved where it lay, the heavy wreckers came to drag it away so that nothing blocked the road for long. A truck too far gone to fix became a donor, stripped for the parts that would keep a dozen other trucks alive. It was a brutal, improvised, around-the-clock effort, and it worked because thousands of men refused to let it fail. And indispensable is the exact word. The trucks the drivers pushed down those roads were mostly a single reliable workhorse, the 2.5-ton, 6-wheel drive cargo truck built by GMC, the vehicle every American soldier knew. Its official designation was a string of letters that meant something only to the men who built it, but the soldiers never called it that. They called it the Deuce and a Half for its rated payload, or simply the Jimmy, a play on the initials of the company that made it. It was, in its own quiet way, a small miracle of American industry. It was easy to drive with almost no training. It was easy to fix in a muddy field with simple tools. Its 6-cylinder engine would keep running when it had every reason to quit. And America built these trucks in numbers that beggar belief. General Motors alone turned out more than 500,000 of them, and with the closely related trucks from other makers, the total climbed well past 800,000 vehicles of this single type. It was the second most produced American vehicle of the entire war, behind only the little Jeep. This was the machine, humble and unglamorous, that carried the Allied armies across Europe. It could carry its rated load, and then far more than its rated load, and on the Red Ball it almost always carried more, stacked so high and so heavy that it strained every bolt. General Eisenhower himself understood exactly how much the war owed to this unremarkable truck. After the war, when he sat down to write about the equipment that had mattered most to victory in Africa and Europe, he named just a handful of items as the most vital of all. Not the tank, not the fighter plane. He named the bulldozer, the jeep, the transport aircraft, the amphibious truck that could swim ashore from a ship, and the ordinary 2.5-ton cargo truck. The supreme commander of the greatest amphibious invasion in history looked back across the whole war and decided that one of the weapons that had won it was a delivery truck. The men on the Red Ball had known that all along. They were driving it. The results were staggering. The Red Ball reached its peak within its first 5 days. On August 29, 1944, 132 truck companies operating 5,958 vehicles carried 12,342 tons of supplies forward in a single day. That one-day record was never beaten across the entire 14 weeks the operation ran. It was the single greatest day of a supply operation the likes of which the German army had never come close to mounting, an achievement measured not in yards gained or positions held, but in the sheer tonnage of war delivered to men who needed it to keep fighting. But raw numbers do not fully capture what these men were doing, so consider the small revealing details. The rules said the trucks should travel in convoys, keeping a careful spacing of 60 yards, holding to a modest speed of around 25 miles per hour, escorted by jeeps front and rear. The drivers, understanding that the only thing that mattered was getting the load forward, quietly ignored most of that. They often left as soon as they were loaded, rather than waiting to form up. Many of them removed the governors from their engines, the devices that limited the trucks to 56 miles per hour, or had the mechanics adjust the carburetors, and then drove faster still, sometimes far faster, careening along at speeds that would have horrified the men who wrote the rules. There was a saying among them, "Red Bull trucks brake, but they do not break." They pushed the machines until the tires gave out. In the first month alone, the operation wore out something on the order of 40,000 tires. Trucks tipped over from being loaded too high. Engines burned out for want of oil and grease. Ordnance crews with heavy wreckers, including the powerful Diamond T that could tow a disabled tank, followed the routes dragging broken vehicles off the road so the river could keep flowing, and trucks too far gone to save were cannibalized for the parts that would keep others running. The men were exhausted past the point of safety, and some of them, desperate for even an hour of sleep, would quietly disable their own trucks to force a halt. They were human beings pushed to the absolute edge of what human beings can do, and they kept the tonnage moving anyway. Now place the two images side by side, because this is the heart of everything. On the American roads, a continuous mechanical river, 12,000 tons in a day, trucks stopping for nothing, driven through the dark by young men feeling the road with their wheels. And on the German roads, in that very same August, in that very same France, something out of another century entirely. Because as the Red Bull Express rolled east, it was rolling past the wreckage of a German army that had been destroyed in large part because it could not move. We began this story on the roads near Falaise, and it is worth understanding exactly what happened there, because it is the perfect mirror image of the Red Bull. In the middle of August of 1944, the German forces in Normandy were caught in what became known as the Falaise Pocket, encircled as the Allies closed a ring around them. Inside that ring, the German army's deepest weakness was laid bare. When the order finally came to retreat, the army could not move fast enough to escape, because so much of it moved at the pace of a marching man and a walking horse. The columns backed up. The wagons and the guns and the animals bunched together on the narrow roads, and the Allied aircraft and artillery fell on them there. The retreat became a slaughter. This was the German army's supply system laid open for the world to see. Animals in harness, unable to run, dying on the roads because there was no engine to carry them away. General Dwight Eisenhower himself walked through the aftermath of the Falaise Pocket, and what he wrote about it has never lost its force. He called the battlefield, unquestionably, one of the greatest killing fields of any of the war areas. He wrote that 48 hours after the gap was closed, he was led through it on foot, into scenes that could only be described by Dante, and that it was literally possible to walk for hundreds of yards at a time, stepping on nothing but dead and decaying flesh. That was the price of an army that moved at the speed of a horse, in a war that was now being fought at the speed of an engine. And the American trucks drove on toward Germany, carrying the fuel that would let the pursuit continue, while behind them, the horses of the old world lay dead in their harnesses. This is the contrast the entire story is built on, and it is worth sitting with. It was not that German soldiers were less brave, or German officers less skilled. Man for man, unit for unit, the German soldier was often a formidable and dangerous opponent to the very end. The difference was not courage, and it was not skill. The difference was that one army had solved the problem of movement and the other had not. One army ran on an engine that could be refueled in minutes and driven through the night. The other ran on an animal that had to be fed roughly 20 pounds of fodder a day, whether it worked or not, that wore out after a week or two of hard labor, that needed months to recover, that panicked under fire, that died by the hundreds of thousands from exhaustion and starvation and cold. Feeding the horses was itself a colossal logistical burden. It was estimated that the horses of a single German division could consume around 53 tons of feed every single day. Fodder, not ammunition, was often the single heaviest category of supply that a horse-drawn army had to move. The horses needed to move the supplies, and an enormous share of the supplies existed only to feed the horses. It was a trap with no exit, and unlike a truck, which sits quietly and consumes nothing when it is parked, a horse eats every day of its life, working or resting, advancing or retreating, useful or not. The animal was hungry whether or not the army was winning. If this story is holding your attention, if you are learning something about this war that you did not know before, take 1 second to hit the like button. It genuinely helps this kind of history reach the people who care about it, the people who want the real story and not the myth. And the real story here is that the men who won the race across France were not only the men in the tanks, they were the men in the trucks, the ones history very nearly forgot. There is a deeper question hiding underneath all of this, and it is the question that should really unsettle us. Germany was not a foolish nation, and its generals were not fools. They knew, better than anyone, that they were riding into a modern war on the back of a 19th century supply system, so why did they never fix it? Why did the army that supposedly invented mechanized warfare remain, underneath, an army of horses from the first day of the war to the last? The answer is oil, and it goes all the way down. Germany had almost no oil of its own. Its main sources were the oil fields of Romania, above all the great fields around Ploesti, and a network of plants inside Germany that manufactured synthetic fuel out of coal through an expensive and difficult chemical process. This was the fragile foundation the entire dream of a mechanized Germany would have had to rest on, and it was never remotely enough. There was not enough fuel to motorize the whole army, and there was not enough industrial capacity to build the trucks, even if the fuel had existed. In the late 1930s, as Germany rearmed, the expansion of the army had already outrun the country's ability to build and repair motor vehicles. The wear and tear on the trucks it did have was chewing them up faster than the factories could replace them, even in peacetime, even before anyone was shooting at them. The choice to rely on horses was not made in ignorance. It was made because the alternative was impossible. You cannot run an army on fuel you do not have, and you cannot field trucks your factories cannot build. And then, as the war turned against Germany, even the fuel it did have began to disappear. In 1944, Allied bombers made the destruction of German fuel a top priority, and they went after the Romanian oil fields and the synthetic fuel plants with everything they had. The results were catastrophic for Germany. Fuel production collapsed to a fraction of what it had been. The Romanian oil, which had kept the German war machine breathing, was choked off and then lost entirely when the Soviets overran Romania in the late summer of that year. By the end of 1944, the shortage had become so severe that it shaped the outcome of battles directly. During the Great German counter-offensive in the Ardennes that winter, the offensive the world remembers as the Battle of the Bulge, the German spearheads drove hard for the Meuse River and never reached it. The lead armored units ran out of gasoline in the field. One of them ran dry only a few miles short of the river it had been racing toward. As the offensive collapsed, German crews abandoned tanks and vehicles along the roads simply because there was no fuel to move them. Some of the most modern and terrifying weapons Germany possessed, its great tanks, ended up as steel hulks by the roadside, out of gas, because there was nothing left to put in them. Meanwhile, the American truck drivers on the Red Ball had, at the height of the operation, so much fuel to move that the operation itself burned around 300,000 gallons of gasoline every day, nearly as much as an entire field army, and America simply absorbed the cost as the price of keeping the river flowing. So the German problem was a cage with no door, No oil, so no fuel. No fuel, so no way to run a mechanized army even if you built one. No industrial capacity, so no way to build the trucks even if you had the fuel. And therefore the horse, endlessly, to the bitter end. And the horse brought its own cage. It had to be fed every day whether it moved or not. It died in enormous numbers and had to be replaced from the farms of occupied Europe, which were themselves being stripped bare to feed the animals and the soldiers both. In the winter, fighting on the Eastern Front alone, in the space of a few brutal months, the German army lost horses by the hundreds of thousands, animals that coughed in the dust of summer and froze in the snows of winter, that bolted from shell fire and collapsed from exhaustion and were sometimes killed for food by the starving men who depended on them. The animals that were supposed to be the reliable, humble, dependable backbone of the army were dying faster than they could be replaced, and every dead horse was a gun that could not be moved and a wagon that could not roll. The German soldiers' own letters and diaries are full of these dying horses. One wrote that the route was lined with dead horses that had broken their legs or collapsed through sheer exhaustion. Another, writing in the middle of 1944, admitted that his division was again relying almost entirely on horses to haul its guns and its equipment. This was not the 19th century. This was the same summer the Red Ball trucks were running. The Americans had walked into the exact opposite situation, and it is worth being honest that they had walked into part of it by sheer good fortune. They had the oil, from Texas and beyond, more than any nation on earth. They had the factories, safe from any bomber, humming 3,000 miles from the nearest front. They had the trucks pouring off the assembly lines in numbers no other country could match. But here is what fortune alone does not explain, and here is what the Red Ball Express actually proved. Having the trucks was not enough. Germany's problem was that it could not build a mechanized supply system in the first place. But America's challenge, in that desperate August, was to use one under conditions no plan had prepared for, and that is a different kind of achievement entirely. The trucks existed. The question was whether anyone could organize them, drive them, repair them, and push them across a ruined country fast enough and long enough to keep an entire army group alive on the move. That part was not luck. That part was the drivers. Machines do not organize themselves. Fortune gave America the trucks. It did not give America the men who drove them without sleep through the blackout for 83 days. Those men gave that to themselves, and to their country, and to a cause that had not yet decided it was worth giving them anything in return. And this is where we arrive at the quiet, uncomfortable truth at the center of the whole story. The men who performed this feat, who kept the most powerful army in the world from strangling on its own speed, were men that same army had judged unfit for the front lines. The Red Ball Express was carried, in its majority, by black soldiers whose country had drafted them, put them in uniform, and then decided in advance where they were permitted to be brave. They were not permitted to be brave in a tank or with a rifle in most cases. So they were brave at the wheel instead, on roads that killed men, in the dark, without sleep, under fire from the air, hauling the lifeblood of the army forward, one impossible load at a time. And the danger was real. It was not the safe rear echelon duty that the word supply might suggest to someone who has never done it. Drivers were killed and wounded by enemy aircraft, by landmines on the shattered roads, by artillery, and by the sheer murderous exhaustion of the job itself. The accidents that come when a man has been awake too long at the wheel of an overloaded machine. They died so that other men could keep fighting, and for a long time their country was not even prepared to admit how much it owed them. That reckoning, when it finally began to come, came slowly, and it came from below. The men who drove the Red Ball and the many hundreds of thousands of other black soldiers who served in the segregated army of the Second World War came home to a country that had asked everything of them and given them very little in return. But they had proven something that could not be unproven. They had shown, in the most demanding conditions imaginable, that the assumptions used to keep them out of the fight were simply false. The performance of black soldiers across the war became one of the arguments, one of the pressures that pushed the United States toward change. In 1948, President Harry Truman signed Executive Order 9981, which called for equality of treatment and opportunity for all persons in the armed services without regard to race, color, religion, or national origin. It did not happen overnight, and it did not happen because the country suddenly grew wise. It happened in part because men like the drivers of the Red Ball Express had made the old lie impossible to keep telling. Even Hollywood, when it finally made a film about the Red Ball in the early 1950s, could not quite tell the truth, and cast the drivers as more white than they ever were. The real story took decades longer to be told plainly. It is being told now. We should be careful and truthful here, because this is history and not legend. The Red Ball Express did not single-handedly win the war, and it was not a perfect machine. It was wasteful. It burned enormous amounts of fuel just to move fuel. It wore out trucks and tires at a frightening rate. It was plagued by breakdowns and accidents and by pilferage, as some of the cargo, especially the gasoline and the cigarettes and the rations, went missing into a thriving black market in liberated France, sometimes taken by exhausted drivers, and sometimes by deserters, and even by a few officers who requisitioned trucks for their own purposes. As the front moved and other supply lines finally came back to life, the Red Ball's usefulness faded. It was shut down on November 16, 1944. By then, the tide of the supply crisis was turning. The port of Antwerp was about to come into service at last, the French railways were being repaired and put back to work, and fuel pipelines were being pushed forward toward the front. It was succeeded by other express routes with other names, the White Ball and others that followed in the months to come, carrying the war forward into Germany itself. It was a rough, improvised, imperfect solution to an emergency, but across those 83 critical days, its trucks carried 412,193 tons of supplies to the armies that were driving Germany back toward its own border, and it kept the advance alive at the precise moment when it might otherwise have died. Eisenhower himself, writing to the men of the operation in October of that year, called it a battle they were waging so well, and told them that each truckload which went through to the combat forces could not help but bring victory closer. So let us return, one last time, to those two roads in France in August of 1944. The one Desmond Scott flew over near Falaise, choked with the wreckage and the dead horses of an army that could not move, and the other one, not far away, flowing without a break, with American trucks driving hard toward Germany. Everything this story has to say is contained in the distance between those two roads. On the one, the 19th century dying in its harness. On the other, the future, driven through the dark by young men most people never bothered to notice. The trucks on that second road came from a country that had oil and steel and factories, yes. But more than that, on that road, in those weeks, they came from the hands of 23,000 American drivers and mechanics, most of them young, most of them black, most of them men whose own army had told them they did not belong at the front, who were at that very moment doing something the entire German war machine, with all its skill and all its ferocity and all its 2.75 million horses, had never once managed to do. They were moving an army faster than an army had ever been moved. The horses could not do it. That was never a failure of the horses. They pulled until their hearts gave out, and they died in their harnesses on the roads of France and Russia by the hundreds of thousands. And they deserve their own kind of remembering, these millions of animals conscripted into a war they could not comprehend. The failure was not in the animals, it was in the cage that put them there, the cage of a nation that reached for a modern war it could not fuel and could not build, and so sent living creatures to do the work of engines, and buried them by the thousand doing it. Germany's horses were the measure of what Germany lacked, and the American trucks, and the men gripping their wheels in the dark, were the measure of something Germany could never match. And it was not only oil, and it was not only steel. It was the willingness of a nation, in the end, to be carried to victory by the very men it had underestimated, and the refusal of those men to give any less than everything, even to a country that had not yet earned it. If your father or your grandfather served in the Second World War, in any army, in any role, driving a truck or loading a ship or firing a gun or anything at all, I would be honored if you told me about them in the comments, their names, their units, what they did, and what they remembered. The men of the Red Ball Express spent decades as a footnote, and the way we keep such men from vanishing is by saying their names out loud. So say them here. This channel exists to remember the ones the films left out, because in the end, that is what this story is really about. Not trucks against horses, though it was that. Not oil against oats, though it was that too. It is about the strange and stubborn truth that wars are not won only by the men history chooses to photograph. They are won so often by the ones left out of the frame. The German army built a legend of engines and hid its horses from the cameras, and it lost anyway, because a legend cannot pull a field gun and a photograph cannot carry a shell. The American army handed its most desperate task to the men it valued least, and those men carried it through the dark all the way to the German border and did not stop. Desmond Scott never forgot the horses lying dead in their harnesses. We should not forget the men on the other road either. There were thousands of trucks on it, and behind every one of them was a driver, and behind every driver was a country that was only beginning to understand what it owed him. If you want more of these stories, the ones about the men who were nearly forgotten, subscribe and stay with us. There are many more to tell, and every one of them belongs to someone who deserves to be remembered, not by the place the world once tried to keep him, but by the thing he actually did when everything depended on it.